she will be our transition panelist.
Okay, so I wanted to start out with a quotation, and this is from Jeffrey Hennick's book Spin Cycle, and it's from an education reporter, and I think this attitude it's not entirely atypical among education reporters. And this quotation goes like this: "I think education research stinks. I think it's awful. I think it's ill-funded. I think it's got an infirmity that's unique to the field, which is that it's field practitioners who do it. It is field practitioners who do it, which does not occur in other fields." Now, I'm not going to go into, I think we all know that a lot of these conceptions are false, so I'm not going to even bother to dispute them. But I am going to use this as sort of a jumping off point to talk about some of the reasons why I think you should put yourself out there as an educational researcher. And I'm going to try to base them on some of the research I did for my prospectus, which I just defended last week. And the topic of my dissertation is how do journalists and bloggers decide which educational research to cover, and what type of educational research gets covered. So one of the main reasons why I think you all should try to put yourselves out there is because of since you haven't put yourselves out there necessarily, people have this sort of very, I think, false and in some ways very negative impression of educational research. And I think that, so in a 2002 survey by the Heckinger Institute on Education in the Media, they found that only 16% of education editors and writers found educational research to be highly credible. On the plus side, 68% found it somewhat credible. But to me, that's, to me that combined with the quotation represents is a bit disturbing for a field that I think really, ideally should be, an applied field in many ways. I mean, as a future faculty member, or a hopeful future faculty member, I would hope that my research would be something that would, positively influence schools and help schools to become, teachers to become better practitioners. Well, if, as the previous speakers have talked about, if the only way your research is getting out is through a journal read by 200 people, the teachers probably aren't going to see your research. And so I think it's even harder for them to see it and understand it if people have these negative impressions that, in my opinion, are really built in some ways out of ignorance. Unlike reporters in the science field, education reporters don't read peer-reviewed journals, and they don't cover a lot of educational research. They cover much less educational research than people in the science field. In fact, a study by the Brookings Institution, the study's been criticized a lot because it's focused only on national news, but I just still think it has merit and it's interesting. This study was released late last year, and it found that, well, first of all, only 1.6% of national coverage, period, involved education. And of that 1.6%, only 1.4% involved coverage of educational research, or stories focused on educational research. Again, people have these assumptions about educational research, but there's not a lot of it getting out there. So that's sort of my first argument, that it's important to put yourself out there because you want to contradict these opinions that all educational research is sort of shoddy and not applicable. And also because it's not really out there, and it's something that I think really should be out there if we want to help improve schools and teaching. My second argument sort of goes a little bit against my first argument, is that to a certain extent, academics do put themselves out there. And so, or at least they try to. I know there's a lot of rejection. And so it's not the effort to contact the media or be in touch with the reporters, that sort of thing. You're probably not the only person in your department who has ever tried that. And so I'm going to apologize in advance. One thing I found in researching my prospectus is there's very little research on the sort of the nexus between education and education policy and the mass media. And so a lot of the research that's out there that I've had to depend on actually involves research on science reporters. That's much more heavily studied, people who cover the sort of the life and physical sciences. And so I'm going to refer to a recent study international study of epidemiologists and stem cell researchers which found that 70% of respondents had engaged in at least one media contact in the past 3 years, with 30% engaging in 5 or more contacts. So at least in the science realm, people are at least trying to get the message out there, or some people are trying. Now that doesn't say whether or not they wrote op-eds or whether the message actually got out there. And it also, education, as I said before, education is a little bit of a different issue. In a much earlier study, Dunwoody and Scott in 1982 found that 78% of social scientists at the University of Ohio and Ohio State had granted at least one interview to a journalist. The average number of interviews per scientist and social scientist was 4.6%. So quite a few people actually are. You won't be the lone black sheep if you're out there, trying to make some contact with the media. And another argument to make in favor of putting yourself out there is that people who have contact with the media generally have a fairly positive impression of their contacts. So they're not necessarily, putting themselves out there and then, saying, oh my gosh, this was a horrible experience. In the study that I just referred to of the epidemiologist, most of the respondents were actually pleased with the outcomes of their personal media contacts, with American and German scientists rating their interactions more highly than their counterparts in other countries. The authors of the study attributed the better-than-expected findings to increased professionalism of science journalism, combined with a degree of trust in academic science that is not necessarily present in attitudes, of course, again, of education reporters, more efficient communication strategies of science, resulting in more influence on the media coverage of science, and a change in the criteria used to assess media performance from scientific content, quality-oriented criteria to strategic PR effect-oriented criteria. I won't go into that. So another reason I would argue that you should try to put yourself out there is that at least one study suggests that we've talked about some of the ways that that putting yourself out there can be detrimental